If you clicked on this video, you've probably heard of Akira Kurosawa. Or maybe you're a big fan of film noir. Or maybe you're just bored and you like to hear people talk about movies in the background. Whatever your reasons, welcome. If you're a fan of Akira Kurosawa, you're most likely familiar with his jidaigeki films like Rashomon, Seven Samurai, Throne of Blood, The Hidden Fortress, and Yojimbo. As awesome as these films are, they only represent about half of his output, and they get way more attention than his noirs. I find this a bit disappointing because his noirs give us a look at what life was like in Japan during the respective years they were made, and put together they allow us to see the socio-economic changes that Japan experienced in the immediate aftermath of World War II up to the 1960s when the country was becoming a global economic power. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Showa Emperor made an unprecedented broadcast announcing Japan's surrender to the Allies. By the end, he called on his people to endure the unendurable. Thus began the difficult post-war years, which could best be described as living in the shadow of the war. Most of the major cities had been bombed, leaving hundreds of thousands of people dead and millions more homeless. Pre-war industries were wiped out. Hunger became a part of daily life. The loss of its colonies in Korea, China, and Taiwan abruptly cut off access to badly needed food. To make matters worse, Japan was experiencing its worst harvest in over 30 years just as millions of veterans and civilians were returning to the main islands from the war front and former colonies. Food shipments from the United States averted an all-out catastrophe, but hunger would remain constant until the end of the decade. This led to the rise of black markets. Less than a week after surrender, the first black market was set up in Shinjuku. 2 months later, there were an estimated 17,000 of them, mostly concentrated in major cities. They were run by local Yakuza gangs with clearly defined territories. The markets were supplied, both legally and illegally, by tapping into food sources from the countryside and looting from Japanese military stockpiles. Vendors would go to the countryside and pay several times more than the fixed market price, making it more lucrative for farmers to sell to the black market than through official channels. Because of this, food prices were exorbitant, several times higher than official government prices. But official rations only provided people with a fraction of what they needed to survive. Plus, government food shipments were extremely irregular. People living in cities had to rely on the black markets to survive. This created an economic drain on many people, and those who couldn't afford the prices went hungry. Although they were technically illegal, the police were complicit in their existence, and even government employees had to rely on them. One Japanese magazine stated that if everyone was arrested for buying or selling from the black market, the whole country would be in jail. It wasn't just consumers who relied on the black markets. Many vendors were business owners who lost their storefronts in the bombings, but many were also new entrepreneurs just trying to eke out a living. In a way, everyone in Japan had to become complicit in criminal activity to survive. So, why film noir? With its stark, high-contrast lighting, intricate plots usually revolving around crime, and sense of disillusionment with the world, it became the perfect vehicle to represent post-war life on film. There are plenty of straightforward films that portray life in the aftermath of the war, but noir has a special way of heightening a character's internal conflict. You don't just see people living on the margins of society. You see the psychological trauma that suffering creates. Noir in Japan wasn't a carbon copy of its Hollywood counterpart. Japanese studios relied on a neo-realist style, confronting the time's grim realities. They focused on grime, poverty, desperation. Though American noir typically featured crime, they usually didn't confront greater societal issues. Crimes in major films like Double Indemnity, Laura, The Maltese Falcon, and Mildred Pierce were apolitical, motivated by money, revenge, or passion. There was also a more practical reason. The Civilian Information and Education Division, an organization created by the U.S. occupation forces to manage the Japanese film industry, banned any depictions of nationalism, patriotism, or feudalistic ideas. This made it next to impossible to get a jidaigeki film made. There were some exceptions, like Utamaro's Five Women by Kenji Mizoguchi, but for the most part, no more jidaigekis. It is amongst this backdrop of poverty and political suppression that Drunken Angel takes place. Matsunaga, a young Yakuza played by a fine Toshiro Mifune. Get used to his face, kids. He's gonna be in literally all the movies I'm talking about. Matsunaga goes to a local doctor named Sanada. No, not that one. Played by Takashi Shimura,
to have a bullet removed from his hand. The doctor discovers he has tuberculosis and wants to treat him. Although the doctor seems to hate Matsunaga, he still insists on curing him. After a few skirmishes, he's finally able to convince the young man to take care of himself, until Matsunaga's predecessor, Okada, no, not that one, unfortunately, is released from prison and begins usurping his position. Matsunaga commits ever more to drinking, gambling, and violence in a futile attempt to maintain his standing, despite his deteriorating health and inability to keep his territory or girlfriend from falling into Okada's hands. After being shunned by his boss, Matsunaga tries to assassinate Okada but is killed during the attempt. His ashes are taken by a local barmaid who previously tried to get him to abandon the gang. The end.
Though Kurosawa had already directed 6 films, Drunken Angel was the first that reflected his own artistic vision. Before then, all of his films were compromised in one way or another, be it by the studio or military censorship. Though he had to work within the confines of American censorship, he worked well within these boundaries and found a level of freedom he never experienced during the war years.
The action of the film centers around a filthy pond, possibly the remains of a bomb crater. Bubbling and disease-ridden, it's become the dumping grounds for the makeshift neighborhood and black market that has sprung up around it. No one tries cleaning it up, despite the fact that it's a disease-infested cesspool. This body of water is the central focal point of the film, a potent symbol of the sickness of Japanese society in the post-war years. The surrounding neighborhood isn't much better. Beyond the pond, everything is filthy, run down. Despite all the fighting, and there's a lot of fighting, many of the characters seem worn down, tired. This is an example of kyodatsu, a term used to describe the collective exhaustion and demoralization of the Japanese people after the war.
You'll notice that there is no mention of the war throughout the film. This is on purpose. Though the US censors were more lenient than the Japanese military, they could still ban any film they wanted for any reason. They were extremely sensitive to anything that could put the US in a bad light, so they opted for erasure. GHQ forbid any visuals or mention of the American presence in Japan, including GIs, English language signs, and buildings run by the occupation forces. Though not explicitly stated by GHQ as off limits, they were careful to excise references to the US bombings of Japanese cities.
Knowing that, it seems a little ridiculous the Drunken Angel made it past the censors. Yeah, they're not technically mentioning the bombings, but come on.
It seems that GHQ was comfortable with talking about just how bad life was in Japan without discussing the role the US played in the country. A disingenuous conversation at best because they ran everything.
However, Kurosawa was able to get a few things past the censors. The opening scene featured pan-pan girls, prostitutes who catered to American soldiers. The dance sequences satirize American jazz music and takes inspiration from Gilda, another American noir. Now, there are many things that you couldn't get outside of the black markets. When Matsunaga pours Sanada a shot of whiskey, a bottle like that could have only come from the black markets and would have been extremely expensive. This also explains why the doctor dilutes his alcohol meant for his patients. Not only is he a raging alcoholic, but there isn't any affordable liquor available. Behind the doctor's supposed disdain for Matsunaga is a sincere attempt to cure him. He sees potential in the young man, and like many other characters, doesn't think he's cut out for Yakuza life. If he could just cure him and save him from the gang, not only would he save his patient, but the world would be a little less sick. It's easy to see why Sanada lashes out at Matsunaga. As a doctor, he hates sickness, and Matsunaga, as a gang member, is perpetuating the diseases affecting post-war life. Crime, poverty, and resignation, caring more about saving face than his own life. When Sanada says, he's referencing changing attitudes towards authority. Unwavering loyalty towards superiors was a traditional value the American occupiers were trying to root out and that Kurosawa personally disdained. Matsunaga has a choice, to start over and take care of himself or self-destruct. After all, isn't his life worth more than a little honor?
As we've discussed, this was a very difficult time to start over. It's assumed that he didn't have any family, and the only people that cared about him were the barmaid and the doctor. Just like Matsunaga, most people in Japan had to start over from scratch, many without homes, families, or money. The Yakuza, with their newfound power, seemed like the best option for someone with nothing. But in the end, the barmaid is right. He isn't cut out for this life. Okada was better than him at everything. Drinking, gambling, and even killing. Although, that's not really something to be proud of.
The film ends with one of Shimura's other patients coming to announce that by taking care of herself, the thing Matsunaga could never do, she is tuberculosis-free, ending the film on a hopeful note. Some people won't change, but others can.
Speaking of change, on to the next film.
Stray Dog opens with homicide detective Murakami, also played by Mifune, riding on a crowded trolley car and realizing his pistol has been stolen. He chases after the pickpocket but eventually loses him. The rest of the film follows him through black markets, baseball stadiums, seedy inns, and train stations, all during a brutal heat wave hunting down his gun. Just like Drunken Angel, Stray Dog focuses heavily on the struggles of life in post-war Japan. Arguably, the most notable scene is an extensive montage of Mifune prowling the black market. Since the sets didn't look realistic enough, Chief Assistant Director Ishiro Honda, yes, the guy who directed Godzilla, decided to shoot in a real black market. Now, as you can imagine, these weren't necessarily the safest places to film, so Honda dressed in demobilization clothes, or former Imperial Japanese military uniforms, and the director of photography hid a handheld camera in a box and followed him around to capture footage. Many of the shots in the montage of Mifune from the waist down are actually Honda. While shooting, they were harassed by a Yakuza, but they were able to fend him off by giving him some rice. Things were not very good. Like Drunken Angel, Stray Dog focuses on the choices of individuals in difficult circumstances. Like Yusa, Murakami was a veteran who had his belongings stolen upon returning to Japan. However, Murakami worked hard and became a detective while Yusa grew bitter and got involved with the Yakuza. Yusa acts as a foil to Murakami. How two people from the same circumstances can have drastically different outcomes. No matter how miserable you are, and as we discussed, post-war Japan was miserable, it's worse to take it out on the world. Murakami embodies the hope of this film, that as long as people are willing to do good, there is hope. Stray Dog, unfortunately, communicates this message in a very preachy way. It feels like there are points where the characters just look directly into the camera and explain the point of the movie. The scene where Murakami is confronting Harumi is essentially spelling out the theme of the film. Shimura and Murakami have two discussions about whether or not they should have sympathy for Yusa. The scene where a husband laments the murder of his wife by squishing all her tomatoes in the garden. You get it? The tomatoes symbolize her life. Despite Stray Dog's shortcomings, it, along with Drunken Angel, act as potent condemnations of post-war life. Not that I think anyone wanted to live like this, but Kurosawa was specifically critiquing the Yakuza and other cronies for taking advantage of the political and economic turmoil, while offering the audience hope and a path forward. To not be resigned, give up, or grow bitter. Yes, times are hard, but they could get better. He urges us not to give in to despair or become like the Yakuza or the politicians, bleeding the country dry. If you're familiar with Kurosawa's filmography, the endings of his films can get kinda bleak. Yes, he had made a few lighter films in the late 50s, but more often than not, they end tragically or at least on a somber note. I don't think it's a coincidence that these two noirs that take place in contemporary post-war Japan ended on a hopeful note. The world is a fundamentally bad place and you can never escape your tragic fate was probably not what people wanted to hear while starving and digging themselves out of the rubble. They needed a positive message. Perhaps that's why Kurosawa got bleaker in the 50s and 60s as things for Japan got better. It's easier to talk about the nature of tragic fate when you're not living it.
The year after Stray Dog came out, Kurosawa directed Rashomon. A moderate hit in Japan, reviews were mixed, but the Kinema Junpo, Japan's most prestigious film magazine, listed it on its illustrious top 10 list. Around this time, the Venice Film Festival formally invited the Japanese film industry to submit a film for competition. Not many Japanese films got international releases, so this was an opportunity for the industry to show its stuff. A woman working for an Italian distributor in Japan at the time recommended Rashomon, which executives at Daiei, the film studio that produced the film, weren't too keen on. They weren't impressed by it, and it had been a few months since it left theaters. But eventually they relented, and the film was shipped to Venice without Kurosawa even knowing about it. It turned out to be a big hit at the festival and won its grand prize, the Golden Lion. It was this win that catapulted Kurosawa to international fame, which he leveraged to earn greater control over his projects. He dedicated the next decade to creating some of his most celebrated works, but interestingly, no noirs. After 1949, and perhaps because waning censorship allowed him to create jidaigeki again, he abandoned the genre until 1960 with
Bad Sleep Well opens at a large wedding reception for Koichi Nishi and Yoshiko Iwabuchi, daughter of the vice president of a government housing company and Nishi's boss. As the ceremony unfolds, it becomes clear that the company is embroiled in a corruption scandal. One of the company's executives is arrested as reporters look on and listen to the other wedding guests, all employees of the company, nervously trying to get through the banquet. Then, a server wheels in a wedding cake in the shape of a large office building with a single rose sticking out of one of the windows, in reference to the death of another executive who jumped to his death to protect the company from a similar scandal 5 years ago. One of the execs, Wada, tries to do himself in to protect the company from another scandal, but is saved by Nishi, who turns out to be the illegitimate son of the company man who jumped from the window. Nishi then proceeds to drive another executive, Shirai, insane, while kidnapping and blackmailing another. Eventually, Iwabuchi discovers his identity and tricks his daughter into revealing her husband's whereabouts. As Yoshiko realizes what she's done, she and her brother go to Nishi's hideout and learn from his accomplice that her husband has been murdered by Iwabuchi's goons. Yoshiko goes insane and Iwabuchi is asked by his mysterious superiors to go abroad. It's easy to see why Kurosawa would approach this project through noir. Along with the script having a lot of the typical elements, he also had experience using the genre to highlight societal ills, in this case corporate greed and corruption. So, what was it that got him interested in the genre again? Kurosawa wanted to make a movie of social significance. He wanted to expose the corruption of those in the highest positions of power in Japan. There was so much corruption at the executive level of Japanese industry at the time. What would happen if somebody investigated the corruption and followed it through to the end? Let's make a thorough story about that, I thought. That's how we started. Two things would be different in 1960. Kurosawa had matured as a filmmaker, and Japan had clawed its way out of the rubble to become an economic powerhouse. The Japanese economy experienced rapid growth following the occupation. By 1952, Japan had regained its pre-war industrial output. Advanced technology was imported to increase agricultural yields and build up industry. Production shifted from light industry products like textiles to heavy industry products, with a strong focus on exports and building capital. The economy grew exponentially, and a large number of people migrated from the country to cities. With economic growth came a rising standard of living. Major cities boasted department stores, shopping centers, movie houses, coffee shops, bars, nightclubs, and restaurants. Of course, these were all present in Japan even before the war, but they were becoming more accessible to the average consumer. As we saw in Drunken Angel and Stray Dog, American popular culture continued to impact Japan. Music like jazz and rock music remained popular, along with American fashion, hairstyles, and dating patterns. Nikatsu, a rival studio to Toho, made their bread and butter by producing borderless action films. Like the name suggests, they usually incorporated action and Yakuza elements. Most notably, they avoided traditional Japanese imagery, instead attempting to evoke the style of American westerns and noirs. The societal changes from the 1940s to 60s are striking. It's clear that Japan has recovered from the war. There's a shift in the focus from poor, down-on-their-luck characters to more affluent individuals. The black markets are gone, shots of the city show tall, modern buildings and cars, American culture is still prominent. Nishi used to be a foreign car salesman, indicating a larger market for such luxuries, and it explains why he drives this awesome American car. Though his older films are well shot, by the time The Bad Sleep Well rolled around, Kurosawa was using long lenses and shooting with multiple cameras at once to help his actors give better performances. He'd also begun shooting in widescreen by the late 50s. The crime and seediness of society is no longer out in the open like the Yakuza prowling around black markets. It's hidden beneath well-pressed suits, expensive cars, fancy dinner parties, and most of all, politeness. Unlike in Stray Dog or Drunken Angel, none of the criminals have to kill their targets themselves. They can just pressure them into doing it. If that doesn't work, they'll just hire someone to finish the job. The real criminals robbing the country blind aren't the Yakuza, who have been relegated to the shadows, but businessmen and corporate corruption. In this era, evil is hidden behind the veneer of respectability.
It's easy to see the evil in characters like Matsunaga and Yusa, but they aren't completely at fault here. The post-war world was harsh, and they only committed their crimes because they felt they lacked opportunities to improve their situations. But the men in the bad sleep well, especially Iwabuchi, don't care about those they hurt and are already very wealthy and powerful. They steal and kill to increase their power, to get richer than they already are. That's evil.
It's absolutely fascinating to see the lengths Nishi will go to exact revenge, how obsessed he is, how he loves his wife but can't bear to connect with her knowing he's out to destroy her father, how exacting revenge on his father's killers may cost his soul. In the scene where he takes Fujiwara and Nishimura to his father's office, he looks at the picture of his father's body crumpled up on the pavement. Next thing we know, he's trying to push Shirai out of the exact same window. Many of the revenge sequences in the movie act more like torture scenes. Kurosawa was heavily inspired by Shakespeare, and though it's not a direct adaptation, the similarities to Hamlet are obvious. Getting revenge on daddy's killers, seeing ghosts, people going crazy, Iwabuchi killing people in his bloodthirsty quest for power. Many of the characters follow the same functions as characters from the play. Yoshiko's Ophelia, Nishi's Hamlet, Tatsuo is Laertes, Itakura is Horatio, Iwabuchi is Claudius. You get the idea. Just as Hamlet staged a play to reveal Claudius's crimes, Nishi sets up the elaborate wedding act to reveal the company's crimes. The reporters and guests act as the audience, and instead of reenacting his father's death, he alludes to it with the cake. The most obvious similarity to Hamlet is Nishi's psychological struggle to avenge his father. As much as he hates his father's killers, deep down he doesn't want to become like them. And that's the key to this film. Like Iwabuchi says, you have to be willing to do anything to get to the top. And Nishi isn't willing to become evil. People like Iwabuchi make it to the top because they see bribery, blackmail, and murder as the necessary steps needed to get ahead. Characters like Okada and Yusa, who fit the stereotype of a criminal, get hunted down and arrested. But as it's capitalists who run society, a businessman can commit the same crimes as a gangster and have little need to fear the law.
But the real question is, did Kurosawa succeed in crafting a film of social significance? Unfortunately, he falls back on old themes. The world is a fundamentally cruel place, and none of us can be good enough to rise above it. He is correct in assuming there will always be greedy men looking to exploit the system, but Kurosawa is not really looking at the systemic problems that lead to corruption in the first place.
Nor is he analyzing problems specific to Japan besides blind loyalty to superiors, which can't be the only reason for corporate corruption in the country. Kurosawa said, "Even while we were making it, I knew it wasn't working out as I had planned. Like the final scene with Mori on the telephone. This is the last of several calls, all apparently to the same person, someone very high in the Japanese government. That suggests, but it is not explicit enough. An even worse man is at the other end of the telephone line. But in Japan, if you go any further than that, you are bound to run into serious trouble. This came as a big surprise to me, and maybe the picture would have been better if I had been braver. At any rate, it was too bad I didn't go further." Despite all this, I think Donald Richie sums the film up best. As a movie of some social significance, it's a failure. This failure, however, is much more interesting than many successes. His portrait of an individual thrown into social action is riveting, and you can't help but root for Nishi the whole way through. There are moments that are just outstanding. The scene where Wada watches Shimura and Moriyama lighting incense, bowing in front of his image and comforting his bereaved wife and daughter, all while listening to a recording of them at a nightclub, laughing at his death. This scene does so much at once. The cruelty and indifference of Shirai and Moriyama, juxtaposing traditional and modern Japanese life, and securing Wada's place in Nishi's plan. Kyoko Kagawa brings a subtlety and complexity to Yoshiko that I think is hard to give to the role as written. Kurosawa didn't write women great, but Kagawa was always able to give his characters a depth that her words and actions may not have conveyed. I find myself coming back to this film time and again because, though the ending falls flat, the ride is incredible.
The Bad Sleep Well touched upon the conflict between advancing in a capitalist system and moral choice, with mixed results. But he knocks it out of the park with...
High and Low opens at the Yokohama home of the wealthy Kingu Gondo, an executive director of the National Shoes. After reprimanding fellow execs over a plot to oust the company president and begin producing inferior products, he reveals to his assistant and wife that he has mortgaged his house and borrowed an enormous sum of money in order to acquire a controlling interest in the company. Suddenly, the phone rings. Gondo answers, and the man on the other end says he's kidnapped Gondo's son, Jun, demanding 30 million yen for his safe return. Gondo says he'll do anything to get his son back, only for Jun to stroll right into the living room. It's revealed that the kidnapper snatched the chauffeur's son, Shinichi, who Jun was playing with that afternoon. A police team, led by Chief Detective Tokura, played by a very hot Tatsuya Nakadai, arrive and begin setting up phone tracking equipment and advise Gondo on how to deal with the kidnapper. Despite the mistake, the kidnapper still demands the ransom or he'll kill Shinichi. After agonizing over what to do, Gondo finally decides to pay, throwing the ransom out of a bullet train window per the kidnapper's instructions. The police eventually uncover the hideout and find the bodies of the kidnapper's two accomplices overdosed on heroin. A letter written by one of the accomplices threatening to spend part of the ransom leads the police to believe the kidnapper off them so that the bills wouldn't be tracked. Further clues lead to the identity of the kidnapper, a medical intern named Takeuchi, but there's no hard evidence linking him to the deaths. To catch him, the police plant a fake story in the newspaper suggesting the associates are alive and spending the money. Then, they fake a note from the associates demanding more drugs. The kidnapper falls for it and gets caught trying to administer a lethal dose of heroin to his cronies. Despite recovering most of the ransom money, it's too late to save Gondo and his assets are seized for auction. The kidnapper, sentenced to death, asks for a prison meeting with Gondo, where the two finally meet.
While rewatching the films for this video, you're welcome, by the way, this took, so much procrastination. I noticed a lot of thematic similarities between High and Low and Stray Dog. They are both films questioning the point of terrible things happening to good people, and the answer seems to be the perpetrators are victims of a society that has left them behind, and they made victims of people who were better off. Yusa and Takeuchi are caught and punished, yet it feels hollow because the lives they destroyed can never be repaired, and this terrible cycle will continue because no one actually solved the societal problems that caused these tragedies in the first place. There's always going to be another Yusa. There's always going to be another Takeuchi.
It's clear that the average citizen has a way better standard of living than in the 40s, but poverty hasn't been eradicated. There are still slums. We see radios and TV sets being sold on the street. Takeuchi even has a radio. It's clear that Kurosawa got more sophisticated as a filmmaker over the years. As discussed, his films from the 40s, especially Stray Dog, can be preachy and a little too obvious. Here, Kurosawa is able to tell the story through small yet powerful details. The living room scenes are clearly staged, but also have a naturalness to them, the positions of the characters reflecting their mood. There are other powerful details. Shinichi being shot at by Jun with a toy gun, foreshadowing his fate if Gondo doesn't pay. They shot this scene on a real train running on the Tokaido line, running from Tokyo to Odawara, specifically for the film. All the passengers were extras, and they had to shoot Mifune throwing the suitcase out the window while the police went to various locations in one take to coincide with the train passing over the bridge. All the cameramen at Toho were needed to film this, and all other productions at the studio had to shut down for that day. The jump cut when Tokura handcuffs Takeuchi, the clock with the seized property sticker on it, they've run out of time. There are a lot of scenes where Takeuchi is looking directly into the camera with his reflective sunglasses, and no matter how hard you try, you cannot see the camera. How did they do this? He's not even at an angle. We instantly recognize the reflection in the dirty water as the kidnapper, as the framing projects his rottenness. But it's also a callback to the dirty pond in Drunken Angel. There are many moments in High and Low that harken back to Kurosawa's previous noirs. The similarities between Yusa and Takeuchi have already been discussed, but the latter character is leaner. We don't need an extensive backstory because anyone who lives here doesn't have it easy. The overbearing heat is also reminiscent of Stray Dog. But it's not hot just to create tension, but to show the class differences. Gando's family has air conditioning, the police, who are more middle class, have electric fans, while Takeuchi has nothing to alleviate the heat. Nishi and Gando are very similar. Both lose because they can't bring themselves to be the cruel-hearted capitalists needed to survive in this new Japan. My personal favorite is this scene. Look familiar? It's a callback to Drunken Angel. This time, Takeuchi throws the carnation away to symbolize how he's about to throw this woman's life away. I wouldn't call this ripping off, if you can even rip yourself off, but a culmination of the skills Kurosawa developed through his career, visiting old themes and ideas, perfecting them without feeling like he's just rehashing old hits. The final scene of the film shows Gando visiting the condemned Takeuchi in prison. He tries to goad Gando into confrontation, continuing this one-sided rivalry that clearly has not worked out for him. This was never about the money, after all. He barely spent any of the ransom. He wanted to humiliate the rich man, see him suffer. To Takeuchi, Gando becomes a symbol of injustice. Why did someone like Gando get to live in a hilltop mansion while he sweltered in the slums? Like he tells Gando,
but it's clear he misunderstood Gando. Just like Takeuchi, he also came from a lower class background, and despite ruining his chances of buying out national shoes, he has been able to find work at another company and become something of a national hero. Though this young man tries to continue this rivalry with Gando, the damage is done. He's already lost his house, his company, and is saddled with debt that he's never going to recover from. Takeuchi's death isn't going to change that. Neither is hating him. In Gando's mind, they both lost.
It's clear that being kicked off his perch has hit Gando hard. He's working hard for his new company to rival National Shoes, but he's been thoroughly defeated. You can tell just by his demeanor. He feels weighed down and exhausted. He just doesn't have the strength to claw his way back to the top.
To clarify, I don't think the point of this movie is, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you'll get to the top too. But an acknowledgement that, as unfair as the world is, we make our own choices. The world made Takeuchi miserable. It didn't force him to commit crime. Those were his choices. Interestingly enough, Takeuchi is condemned for making bad choices, like, murder, while Gando is condemned for making a good choice, saving Shinichi.
In an all-or-nothing game like capitalism, doing the right thing will cost you. But unlike Takeuchi, Gando's choices allow him to keep his humanity. In the windows of the prison, we can see the two men's reflections superimposed on one another. This symbolizes the similarities between the two men. They came from similar backgrounds and, like Takeuchi, Gando was ready to commit heinous acts just to increase his power and prestige. There was even a moment where he was ready to sacrifice Shinichi for his buyout, yet he still chose to do the right thing. Takeuchi, on the other hand, chose to commit evil. And it feels like such a waste of his talents. He was studying to be a doctor and came up with this ingenious plan. If the cops hadn't tricked him into thinking his accomplices were still alive, he may well have gotten away with murder. Given a few years, he definitely could have gotten out of the slums and maybe attained the same level of success as Gando. At the end of the day, all we have are our choices. Fortunes can be swept away, but no one can take away our humanity. It can only be forfeited. Unlike Kurosawa's late 40s films, his 60s noirs don't end on a hopeful note. If Drunken Angel and Stray Dog ask the audience not to fall into despair, The Bad Sleep Well and High and Low tell us not to be too optimistic. No good deed goes unpunished. Gando was kicked out of the company, and his assistant, who betrayed him and revealed his plan to the board when he suspected Gando was going to pay the ransom, is promoted. The film is asking if the son of a chauffeur is worth as much as the son of a businessman. Gando ultimately comes to the conclusion that yes, Shinichi's life matters more than his personal success, while the execs at National Shoes, his creditors, and even his own assistant look down on him for that, balking at his inability to sacrifice a life in order to achieve his goals. Just like the executives in The Bad Sleep Well.
Under capitalism, you have to be the right kind of evil. Not criminals like Yusa or Takeuchi, but the kind of person who would let their employees or a child die so that they could get what they want. I think watching all 4 films together was a great way to see how Japan changed over such a short period of time. They exist as testaments to how people lived back then, what conversations were being had, and trying to understand Japan's place in the world amongst so much change. It was also a great way of seeing Kurosawa evolve. The first films he had real creative control over were noirs, and it's great seeing him return to the genre at the height of his career, watching how he evolved with the times and how he created more complex narratives. I hope you all liked this video. It's been a real dream of mine to explore my passion for Japanese cinema on YouTube, and by watching, you've made that a reality, and I couldn't be more grateful. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.